Good evening. Welcome to Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative's new and emerging teacher cadre for May. Our topic today is going to be universal design for learning, and our presenter will be Miss Kimberly Sargent. So thank y'all and enjoy the session.
Um, hey, you guys. I'm not usually Kimberly, so thank you, Doug. That was real nice. Okay, so universal design for learning. I'd like, as always, I like to say hello and thank you to Denny Palme because he's the one. He and Dion introduced me to this, and it completely changed how I saw the classroom. Because I think that for me, especially being in the general classroom or whatever you want to call it, I had the opportunity. I had co-teachers that through them I learned never utilized to to the depth and the height that they should have been. If I go back into the classroom, that's going to be number one on my list. But also with that is going to be looking at accommodations and modifications very differently because of UDL. Making those resources accessible to every student is a genuine task and incredibly difficult. But the way that we can do that is through the universal design for learning model. So that being said, what's involved in all of that? But before we do that, we're going to do a waterfall chat. This is going to take about 20 seconds. So, don't, I'm going to ask you guys this question. Do not hit send in the chat yet. Okay. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. So what is your go-to resource when you are working with your students? Is it a graphic organizer? Is it a strategy that you use with your students, especially if you are the co-teacher, when the classroom teacher passes something out or hands something, gives you something to work with, the students, or if they've given everybody something and you're looking around and you're going to those students who may be struggling within that, what is your go-to? So in 10 seconds, go ahead and type that in there. What is your go-to? Going to give you a few seconds to do that. And then when I say send, we're going to go ahead and put it in the chat. So ready, 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So go ahead and type that into the chat. And Chastity and Doug and Dion, if you guys want to do that there. And Doug, since you can see the chat better than I, if you don't care to read those off for me, that would be awesome.
Right. Looks like we have some guided notes, super teacher, graphic organizers.
Awesome. So that being said, today, as we look at UDL, I want you guys to start thinking about some of those, so adding some of these tools and strategies to your toolkit so that you can work with those. And then most importantly, if you are a co-teacher and you want to share this PowerPoint and most importantly, some of the resources that we're going to share today with your co-teacher, then that is definitely something I'm going to encourage you guys to do. So I'm going to work with you guys, much like I work with students within our new social studies standards. And one of the things that I love about our standards is that they're set up on inquiry. So for us in social studies, we're going to organize our units around this thing that we call a compelling question, because that's going to drive all the learning. So if you're going to answer a compelling question, though, you've got to have a supporting question. And that supporting question is going to be all the little things you need to know to answer the big thing, which is the compelling question. So what's driving all of our learning today is how do I make resources accessible to all students? And when we say resources today, I want to take a minute to define that. Resources are going to be sources, they're going to be text, they're going to be anything that we use in the classroom to help our students to drive their learning. So that being said, so we're going to have to answer 4 smaller questions to help us understand how we interact with those resources on behalf of our students. So one thing we're going to look at is how do I bring every student into the lesson? Because I think that's something especially because sometimes our kids are not going to start with, not all of our kids are going to start right with us into that lesson. So we really have to, find that thing that we're going to do to bring everybody in, because that learning must be equitable and accessible to all students. So the second question we're going to look at is how is an accommodation and a modification different? And I think that for us, and I'm going to say us as in general education teachers, that is the beauty when you have a co-teacher or when you have that resource teacher that comes to work with your kids, whatever it may be. there's an understanding there that you guys have that we do not have sometimes as general education teachers. So this may be a tool that some of you guys want to use with those teachers to say, let's develop some understanding around this so we can know, so especially so they can know how to utilize you the best. And then, and especially for those of you that are self-contained, sometimes there may be, a little further clarification that you need. I would even share with your students sometimes so that they know, so they can be their own best advocate. So how do I ensure that all students have access to the information? That is extremely important because we have a federal mandate to even do that. And how do I plan a lesson around the students' needs? And that's going to be the last thing that we look at. So universal design for learning. So the how for accessibility. So I think that in some ways, when you look at the goals for universal learning, and especially when we come down to the bottom, that's going to be one that I'm going to talk about. And that Stephanie Kidd, who is the, oh my gosh, the math supports person extraordinaire. She and I had a really, I think, reflective and rigorous conversation about that this morning as we talked about this presentation. So the whole idea behind universal design for learning is to create fully inclusive classrooms. Being a high school teacher, that was one of the hardest things that I did every single day because we have to make that learning accessible for everyone. And sometimes we as teachers, as general ed teachers, do not have that capacity sometimes. Access and equity for every student, that is something that I am incredibly passionate about, not just because, that I may have a child that's important to me, but most importantly, that I, as a student, when I think back, there was information that I came into that I was not prepared to learn, and that was not addressed. So guess what? I didn't learn it. So I even have personal experience, in this. To regulate emotions, I think that for me, again, going back to my high school experience, I think about those students who would get pretty frustrated, and I did not know what to do to help them. So in that moment, they did not fail me, I failed them. So then we look at the environment for culture of inquiry, but also just, and inquiry doesn't always just mean social studies. Inquiry in and of itself is learning. But in that last part, that civic space, sometimes when we see that word civic, we think, oh, here she goes, bringing in government kind of stuff. Civic doesn't always mean government. Civic means inclusion. Civic means every voice. And I even jotted something down today that Stephanie said because I thought it was really powerful. Civic means that that student has value in that place. And I think that that's really important because value in that place for that student is a social emotional learning component. And you guys know that that's something that we've heard a lot, especially post-COVID. And for those of us in those districts that were impacted, actually for all of us, we were impacted in some way in all of our districts. And that is, especially post-flood. So thinking about that, we've got to create those places where every student feels valued. So the principles, and again, this slide always goes crazy. There are three main principles in this. Principle number one, provide multiple means of engagement. That means that our students are going to have very different on-ramps to any kind of information. Again, I talked about me earlier because that's kind of the realm of my experience. I can speak personally to that, is that especially in some classrooms, and I'm just going to say it out loud, and in a minute, I'm going to have to talk about math. For me, it was in the math classroom. The science classroom, I didn't have as many, on-ramps and that kind of thing. And of course, the social studies classroom was not a problem for me. English, was not, and reading were not huge problems for me either because I had the luxury of having a third grade teacher that I went home to every evening who could help me with that. But in terms of math, I had a very different on-ramp. So engaging in that learning. And so we're going to think of those students engaging. We've got to find ways, and we've got to make multiple ways for them to come into the learning. Principle two, provide multiple means of representation. I think that, for those students in the learning, once you get in there, always approaching it, that there's always going to be a reading we do. There's going to be some kids that are going to have a problem with that. We've got to find ways for the content as we learn it, that there has to be multiple ways to represent that information. Because again, it's going to be about equity and access for every student. And then the last one, in terms of multiple means of action and expression, we have to give those students multiple ways to express their learning. We have to find a way to know that they've learned. So we've got to also find their way that they express their learning. So, this kind of really breaks down the three principles of UDL, and I love this. And I found it, as you guys see on the bottom, CAST.org or CAST Incorporated. So when you look at each of these, there's your engagement, your representation, and your action and expression. And you can even see, just like it says on the first one, the engagement is the why. So we've got to connect to this, with the students about the why we're learning this. A representation is the what we are learning. And then, of course, the action and expression is going to be the how we are learning. This is going to be right there for you guys. If I were planning lessons, this is what I'm going to have up because I've got to know this. And the other thing that I love about this graphic organizer is how it goes through each level. That is going to be initially bringing in the access, and you can see that across the board. Then you're going to be building the capacity for that student. And then the last one, that skill or that information is going to be internalized. And then on the bottom, of course, because it's going to be all about creating those expert learners, because that's our goal. There were, the first one there in terms of engagement, purposeful and motivated, bringing those kids in. They want to learn it because you have, given them an on-ramp to learn that information. Then the second, resourceful and knowledgeable. Those kids is going to be all about that information. They're going to have a way, because we've brought them in, now they're there, and we're going to make sure that we're going to find those modalities and the ways that they can learn that information. And then the last one, strategic and goal directed. That student knows the expectation and they have a way to meet it. So we have to really, and so I love this. So I made sure this was accessible for you guys. So where do we implement? So when we start thinking about our classrooms, we're engaging in questioning. How do we engage in questioning in the classroom to bring every student in? So for me, it's going to be creating inquiries in science. It's going to be inquiries. It's even going to be in reading and writing that we're going to have those inquiries, because really, when you think about that big learning that they do, they're going to be bringing in different sources and different text to bring those students in. But today we're going to use a math example so that you guys see how we use those questions to do that. In terms of sources, we're going to start talking about modifications and multiple formats to share that information. And then, of course, the task, the things that they do, those activities or whatever it may be. And, as it says here, implementing multiple platforms to communicate. And today we don't have time to do every single, but maybe one of those that we talk about, you're going to say, hey, maybe I could do this and this, because this is something we use all the time. I think that for me, I would count myself successful today if you guys were able to look at each of these and say, I use this for questioning. Now I know how to utilize it better, or whatever it may be, whichever one of these categories. That would be phenomenal for me. So our first supporting question to lead us to that compelling question that we're going to look at is, how do we bring all students into the lesson? So, and here we're looking at principle 1, provide multiple means of engagement. So, when you all think about, and I know that as we talk today, I think one thing I would really like for you guys to do, because that will help you focus your learning, is as we go through each of these, I would love for you to find a student in each of these principles. So when you think of that student that you have that has difficulty engaging in the lesson, I know you're thinking of multiples, but I think for this moment, for your learning, is to think of a student that how can I really get them into that lesson? And maybe especially once we start talking about the strategy, you'll say, wait a minute, this is going to help that student. So what does this look like in the classroom? What's using student questions to drive the inquiry or the learning? Strategies for discussion. Those questions, that we use can drive those strategies, but multiple modes of assessment, formative and summative. So looking at this, and we're going to talk about it. So what does this look like in the UDL classroom? So the ones we're going to look at is using student questions to drive the learning, or targeting student needs. We're going to use those questions to help us identify that. So why do we ask questions? Well, we ask questions because we want to activate curiosity, or we want to give the students a prompt to activate their curiosity. You're going to see that today. We want to connect students to the concept that we're studying. This is another reason that we use questions. But look at the last two. For me in social studies, we develop supporting questions so that we can direct the student learning. But most importantly, we use questions because we want to increase the rigor through relevance. Relevance is going to be a key for you with your students, is that if it's relevant to them, they're going to want to learn it. But you can do that by allowing them to ask their questions and then even finding answers to those. So 3 strategies we're going to look at within this category. So this is why I say you may find a strategy that you really like. So we have question formulation technique, visible thinking strategy, and zooming in. So let's look at the first one. So in talking to Stephanie, and I even have manipulative here for the teacher. So when we start talking about questioning in mathematics, they have a practice for that now, identified practice, and it's called posing purposeful questions, because you want to drive the student learning. And she has a manipulative here, or really just this as a tool. This is something the teacher uses that they can go through, because the whole idea is not to give the student the answer, not to always go at it from just one angle, but there's different practices within that the student has to engage in mathematically. And there are questions that they use. And each of those, for instance, look and make use of structure. So she has questions on the back of that you ask the student to help them reason into that. And most importantly, to make, look for and make use of structure, because structure in mathematics is important. So in strategy 1, what we're going to do is we can throw this up there for our students to look at in terms of equations. So when the students are looking at this, so they're talking about variables. So the students are going to look at this and they're going to ask their questions. And in just a second, I'm going to show you how we're going to use those questions. If you were looking at this as a student, do not use your teacher mind for this one. What would be a question that you would ask? These are questions that students really did generate. So I think, what did the smiley faces mean? And by the way, this was a 4th grade class. And these are questions that they asked. But here's something I want you guys to notice. When I look at these questions, and when I tell teachers about question formulation technique, and I use this as an example, and it's very important to me, just like I told you guys earlier, I would have loved to have been able to learn math the way that I learn. And most importantly, I would have just liked to have learned math, period, because I think that would have opened up even more learning and even more opportunities for me. So, but when I look over this, or when I teach this to teachers, what I tell them is that, giving all the kids a Post-it note, and having them put their name on the front of the Post-it note, not on the sticky side, but to put it on the front, and then flip it over and put their questions on the side that has the sticky on it. And I want them to do that because, for one thing, kids are not going to always ask the questions they need to ask unless they know they're going to have the opportunity to be anonymous. But it shouldn't be anonymous completely to the teacher, because you need to know what skill they lack. So this is why I say this is going to be a point of engagement, because if you can target student need, there's an opportunity to do that within the question formulation technique. So if you had to identify a student here, by the way, question number 9 would definitely be a question I would ask. Does it mean 24 is a really happy number? I've got no understanding of variables, none. Okay, that's where I would go. Okay, but now you're looking at this. So what would be, if you had to look at a number, let's say for instance, a student that that gets it, which one of these would be a student that you would identify? That you're thinking that kid has it, they know it. So who would that kid be? What number? Let's see. I'm going to go with the kid that I would look at this. I would say this kid they've got somewhat of an understanding. They said, can we replace each smiley face with an 8? Let's see. There was another one I saw. Do we always have to use 3 things? Is the let's see. Why is it 24 first? There's all kinds of questions there that, or the questions the kids have asked that were like, wait a minute, this kid either has a need or this kid knows what's happening. Okay. So question formulation techniques gives you the opportunity, going back and look at this really quickly. Again, this could be a picture. This could be photosynthesis. This could be, just a graphic there of photosynthesis, and the students ask the questions. You could just have the arrows on it, no words. Or you could have the parts identified, then with the arrows, and then the students may ask questions in between each step. I use this all the time with social studies, and it's great. I had a teacher in English language arts that I was in their classroom, and they were using the cover of the book, no title, no author. They put the cover up there, and they let students ask questions, and those questions were used as they read the book that they could answer. Because, covers of books sometimes makes us want to buy them. So another we could use is zooming in, because we have those students. So we're thinking of this in terms of assistive technology and that kind of thing. So this is what I want you guys to think about. So sometimes there are images that we have to use in the classroom. And if we because this is a really complicated image that we use in social studies, and that's why I chose this one. There are so many bells and whistles to this thing, but there is so much learning in this image that I really need the students to grab onto. Okay. Maybe I've done some lecture. Maybe I've done some reading. I've done all kinds of things maybe that I'm going to, or that I am going to do after we look at this. But I really want the students to be curious about this picture. But there is so much to see. They're going to have a real hard time being curious. So I'm going to give the kids this image. And most importantly, I'm going to do one of two things with it. I'm going to take this image and I'm going to blow it up and I'm going to cut it into fourths. I'm going to give each of them a quadrant. Okay, that is in groups and pairs, because another component of UDL is giving the students the opportunity to collaborate, to learn, because our students need that support. So I'm going to blow this thing up. I'm going to cut it into quadrants. I'm going to pass it out to all the different groups. And then I'm going to give everybody in the room a little piece of assistive technology, and it's a magnifying glass. Because like I said, when you guys look at this and you start looking around and you can process, because you naturally as an adult learner, you will go to parts. Like you might go up here first, and then you're going to come down and say, oh, I see this. Or some of you guys are going to look, just like some of your students, you're going to look to the center of this and you're going to look to the people, not realizing that there's all kinds of learning around it. So to give you guys an example, I'm going to show you one of my quadrants. This is the upper left corner. Actually, it's a little bit more than that because Google would not cooperate today. So I probably would have cut this off about right here. I would have given everyone the title, by the way. That would have been at the top of their paper so everybody knows the title. And then they're going to get their quadrant. So in this case, you can see there's dates on the skulls. My students are hopefully going to circle or highlight that and then write their question around that. There are names on each of these ships, which are important. You know, it's going to be very important. Here are the name of cities: Leeds, Halifax, Manchester. But this is all about the Stamp Act. This is something that is extremely important in social studies. Every grade, 5th through 8th, because not every grade, but 5th and 8th grade are going to talk about this in their social studies standards. So there's a whole lot of learning to be had and a whole lot of learning to be done, but I want every kid in it. Another component of UDL is that you're going to use these strategies that every kid is going to use. So it's not like some kids are going to stick out because they really are the ones that need it. If every kid uses it, it's commonplace and there's comfort. And in that comfort, there can now be collaboration and discussion across the board. There's a real leveling of the playing field with universal design for learning. And that's one component that I absolutely love about it. And then the last strategy to look at is visible thinking strategy. Again, forgive me, I'm going to use a social studies image. I looked for another image on this one today and I thought, I'm going to spend so much time doing that. I'm not going to do what I need to do on the rest of this. So I didn't bring that one in. But again, talking about the Stamp Act. And one reason why I was kind of glad to do this is to show you guys how you can build learning in the same area. So this is another image from the Stamp Act. So these questions here, and by the way, these are really good for K3, these questions, because what is going on in the picture is going to be the first question that you ask. So I'm going to ask you all, what is going on in this picture? So I want anybody, pop it in the chat or open the mic. What is going on in this picture? Because I'm going to model this strategy really quickly. Ooh, I got a couple. Oh, this is so exciting, Doug.
Looks
There's
like
two chats.
type of protest.
Okay, some type of protest. What's the other one say?
Protest as well.
Okay.
Maybe
So
a parade.
maybe a parade. So, okay, so if I have a student that says, looks like a protest, my next question will be, what makes you say that? So this is why this is really good for K3, because this one is spoken. This is good for every grade level because this is a completely spoken activity. Whereas QFT can be written or spoken, this one typically is spoken because this was designed by museum folks. The man's name was Philip Yenawine and a group that he was working with at a museum. And they designed these questions because when you go into a museum, you're looking at, sculptures, you're looking at paintings, portraits, and this kind of thing. And the kids were just looking, but they wanted it to be interactive. So they developed these questions around that. So what is going on in this picture? So you guys, it looks like a protest. Gosh, excuse me. So now I'm going to say to you, what makes you say that? What makes you say that it's a protest? So one of you folks that said that, pop that in the chat real quick. What made you say looks like a protest? And while you're typing that in the chat, hopefully, what made you say that? I want to remind you guys, visuals are a great way to bring every student in. So this is, and I'm a visual learner too. That's one of my modalities. So that's why we love to use that. So why would you say that looks like a protest? Don't be afraid. Oh, there it is. No right or wrong answers. It's just thinking.
So it looks like they're weapons, then smoke and fire.
Smoke, fire, and weapons.
Violent images. Looks like
Oh yeah. What's some of those violent images? Or some of y'all looking at those effigies in the background hanging and on a stick?
Yes.
That scare me too. And notice we got a little skull, skull there. This is not a party, folks. This is not a tea party. This is not something I want to be invited to. Okay. So then so just like in this moment, but notice you got the other question, what else can we find? So when the question's lull, because what's going on in this picture, a protest, what makes you say that? The violent imagery, the smoke, the fire, gosh, excuse me, these effigies and everything else hanging. So kids are going to sit there for a while. Then it says, what else can we find? Which is then going to sit, lead us on. And the kids are going to say, well, I see small children here. Why are small kids at this? They're going to start asking more and more questions. We can use those questions as we write those down for the kids on the board. When we start going into the lesson, the small reading that may join this or whatever, we look at them and say, okay, what question can we answer now that we've read this? Now let's read the next paragraph. What can we answer? So what would be a tool? Again, this thing is so sensitive. So which tool did you look at just now that you think would work best with your students? So I'm going to give you a second to think about those. QFT, visible learning strategy, zooming in, which one of these, and like I told you, so now that you've had the opportunity to maybe think about that student, okay, which tool would be good for that student? Looks like we got a couple of folks there, Doug.
We have visuals.
So asking those questions into those visuals. So which technique with the visuals did you like? The visual thinking strategy, QFT, zooming in? Which strategy would you use?
Zooming in.
Zooming in. Yeah, I like that one a lot. Because again, doesn't matter if you are visually impaired or if you're just, and we have those kids that have a hard time focusing in. There's so many things in it that we give them the opportunity to focus in. They're going to find one of those things that we really need them to find. So again, where do we implement? I always like to put this slide back up. So another place that we implement. So how's an accommodation and modification different? So I want to talk about this one really quickly because we're getting ready to go into using sources and text. And when we start talking about that, we have to be really careful. So this is something that you guys talk about all the time. But again, this is a component here that you may want to share if you're a co-teacher. So we have to understand what modification and accommodation means. So when we talk about modifying, okay, that is changing the what of what you're learning. And you have to be super careful for that, okay? Because we have standards that drive the what we have to teach. So we can't just go playing with that every day. Okay. When we start looking at this and you're thinking, well, I'm going to change the reading levels. Well, sometimes when you change those reading levels, and that's why we're here today, because we're going to show you how to do that and do it safely according to the standards, we have to be real careful with that. So we start looking at those tools like excerpting, which sometimes I have a hard time saying, paraphrasing, or playing with those lexile levels. So, those reading levels. So if we start talking about that, we've got to be very careful and make sure the whole what we're teaching is not changed. Then on the other side of that, accommodation is where that's going to be student centered. Okay. Modification is going to change it. If you change it, it's going to be for the whole room because everybody's going to have equity and access to that. When we come over here to the accommodations, that can really target for the student. That's the how they interact with it in order to engage in that learning. And you guys know this stuff, but that's just like a quickie review. So we start talking about examples of that. That's going to be assistive technology. Like I said, everybody is going to have, a magnifying glass. And by the way, they have a magnifying glass app on cell phones now. So this whole idea that you have to buy a big old bunch, don't have to do that. Common platforms, and you guys are going to see that in a little bit, and then other literacy strategies, which again, you are going to see. And this thing keeps going back on me. So really quickly, talking with Stephanie this morning, we had this idea for us to kind of review and talk with you guys. So when you look on here, so I'm going to ask you guys, a teacher paraphrases a source to lower the lexile for a student. Is it an accommodation or a modification? And you guys know this. So we'll do that one very quickly. We know that from that paraphrasing is a modification. So again, we have to be careful with that. The teacher gives a student a recording of the class reading gives a student to a student, got a double student there, I'll fix that, who is a struggling reader. If that student is able to read and listen at the same time, can be accommodation for them. The student speaks into a Google Doc or Flip to submit a response. Again, That's an accommodation, because that's the way that student, that's going to be one of those that we talk about at the end, a way for them to represent the information and to represent their learning. A student carries a magnifying glass. Again, that's going to be, assistive technology. So that's, going to be something that everybody's going to use. So that's good. That can be an accommodation that's applied across the board. Student choosing a bead manipulative to help them with addition and subtraction. Again, that is an accommodation, not a modification. So as we go into this next question, I should say supporting question number 3. I changed that twice. So how do we ensure that all students have access to the information? So this was that third question that we need to look at, because that's really important to us. I know that's important to you every single day. So we look at that principle 2, provide multiple means of representation by providing content using multiple formats and platforms. So we have to find lots of ways for them to access that. So one of those things that we're going to look, a couple of those things we're going to look at is going to be making tools and technology commonplace for everyone, using assistive technology or tools that everyone is going to use. So in this case, what it's going to be, so when we look at these sources in text, we're going to determine that equal access and equity of the information impacting student performance, because it will, because we're going to see that emotion hopefully be regulated as the information is accessible to everyone in the same way. We're also going to level that playing field, like I mentioned earlier, but also we're going to address how to create a culture of learning and collaboration. So 3 tools I'm going to use here for this one is going to be Rewordify, ChatGPT, and chunking. So sometimes sources need to be modified. So again, if we're talking about modification, I'm once again going to make sure everybody is going to use that modification. Okay. And there's going to, and obviously there's a reason for that. But we're going to look at it in terms of length, lexile, and or delivery. So if they need to be modified, one of those that we can go into, and how much time? Oh, it's already after 7. Rewordify.com is behind a paywall, and I don't always like to cut, but you could actually use it. You could try it out free. Some folks will go in and just kind of change that, but that is, and so because there is an issue, like, being behind a paywall and that kind of thing, I don't always go into depth, but you can take this, cut and paste, and put it in there. And let me go to the next slide. What happens with Rewordify, though, when it paraphrases the whole thing. So sometimes what can happen there is that we can lose the vocabulary. So looking at this, so that's why I say use it judiciously. If you lose the vocabulary, if that specific vocabulary is sacrificed, what you have to do is you have to go back into that and insert that vocabulary where you've lost it. So this is, so like it says here, the strategy works best for passages for conceptual understanding. If there's not crucial vocabulary that's going to be taught, but it's more for the concept, then I don't feel as nervous about using Rewordify, because I'm going to pop it in there and it's going to paraphrase it for the whole room and everybody's going to use it. And then we're going to have the opportunity as a class, when we go into that activity, that we're going to use that conceptual understanding with, or when I'm going to go into the next stage of the learning and again, have another way that I represent it. And then I'm going to go into the activity where we learn it. But this is going to be something that is done conceptually, then I'm good with that, because I know that everybody's going to be using that. But another format that we can use, and this one can lower lexile and not lose. So again, this is for the students that need lower lexile reading, but we don't want to lose the vocabulary. Okay. And if you've not heard of ChatGPT, we had a training about this a few weeks ago, and Dion was part of that. And we all looked at all the different ways. What this is AI. This is, as a teacher said to me the other day, this is when computers really start getting smarter than us and start communicating like us. Well, we're not exactly there yet. Singularity has not happened. Okay. So that's the good news. But it's artificial intelligence, which means, like it says here, natural language processing. It kind of talks with us and talks like us, rather. So, and then with the deep learning algorithms, there's the ability for it to translate and talk back to us. And also, most importantly, get out there in the internet and see what other people are saying about it. I know. So I'm explaining something that I have no business explaining. So if you want more information about AI, I highly encourage you to contact the Holler and talk to one of those gentlemen. They can explain to you better, or access our training on the Holler that talks about ChatGPT. So when we start talking, it can analyze and generate human-like responses, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. It's kind of exciting, that part can. It can automate repetitive tasks that we have to do and provide swift and personal feedback. But most importantly, I want to go into and let you guys say, I do not recommend it for lesson plans. And as far as student access, That's a little bit scary because it will write papers for you. So what I used it for is I went in, and this was an excerpt that I wanted to use with all of my students. But I knew I wanted to make sure that the information was going to be accessible to every single student in the room. And because I did, I knew there was, like, for instance, when I look at this, if you guys had to look at this, what would be some of those words that would be a stopping point? So I'm going to give you 45 seconds to read this, and then I would love for you to put in the chat, what are some words or phrases there that would be difficult for your students? Okay, something popped up there, Doug. We had a couple. What were those?
Boom towns, migrating. I would think also just industrial centers,
Yep, industrial. They'll be like, well, what's industrial? I see another one came in there. What was another one?
migrating,
Migrating.
and
Yeah,
phenomenal.
phenomenal. Yeah, because that's a descriptive word that we may or may not have to use. And I want to tell you guys a little secret. We've got to keep the word migrating. And so you'll see that in just because that's a concept that we must teach in social studies. So here's what I did, because I wanted to make this easier to read so I could focus on the big words. So words in this, and I'll show you here in just a second. So I went into ChatGPT and I said, please translate this, make this lower Lexile. And all I said was lower the Lexile of the following. And I popped this in here, and here's what it produced. So it said during World War II. Now you guys look up at the top. I'm going to read the bottom to you so you can look at the top and see how it changed it. During World War II, more people moved around the United States than ever before. Many went to cities where they could get jobs, helping the war effort, and they felt proud to do so. Some cities grew really fast because of this. For example, Redmond, California's population went from 24,000 to over 100,000 during the war. Conceptually, I want my kids to know this, but they need to know some pretty important elements to that. They needed to know what a boomtown was. They needed to know migrating, because that's really important, especially within World War II. But patriotic duty is very important within World War II. Now, industrial, again, I'm going to come back to this because it's in here, but I just wanted to throw some words out there to see if it would keep them. So you guys see, look how it kept it. So I'll let you guys read that. Now it goes back to the original just a little smidge because it kept. So now I can take this because the concept of people moving around is still simplified, but now we've got a name with it, or in this case, a verb, because migrate is one of those verbs that we must teach. Goes on down, many industrial centers became boom towns. It actually helps me define what a boom town is. Now I can talk about what industry is. By this time in a student, because this would be 11th grade, by this time we've talked about industry quite a bit, especially when we talk about the Gilded Age. So there's going to be some conceptual understanding around that, but now we can really send that home with the idea of a boomtown. And then also population growth, that's a demographic concept. So now I'm able to introduce, the whole idea of population, census. There's going to be all kinds of learning that I can develop around this, but some important points to look at the bottom. So in order for us to know what to teach our kids, we have got to deconstruct our standards, because just as, as when I talk with folks that work with you guys in special education, we realize the federal mandate, our students not only have to access, as you guys see on the bottom, the standard, but there's the expectation for them to meet the standard. So it's those scaffolds that we build in between to make sure that they do. And this is going to be one of my scaffolds, because conceptually everything's here. And now in terms of the standard, also these other words are here that are incredibly important. So that was ChatGPT. Now ChatGPT, in full disclosure, let me go back for a moment, may be blocked. You can have your own personal one that you can use at home to do this. But it may be blocked in some school districts, and you guys understand why, because of the as I mentioned earlier, the danger for plagiarism and for it doing folks assignments as far as student chat GPT. That's a little bit scary. So those skills and things like that I want the kids to master, we're going to do it in the classroom, and the students are going to do it. So because I'm going to monitor that kind of thing. I've read a really good article the other day that said what we do inside the classroom and outside the classroom now has completely changed because of chat GPT. But sometimes, and this is where we with chunking, sometimes sources have to be accommodated for varied reading levels or supporting struggling readers. And this has happened a lot. So we look at this. This is going to be a tool. And again, I learned this from my buddy, Denny Paul May, taught me this. also, especially from the social studies perspective. So when we start looking at these segments or these readings that we're giving the students, we're going to make sure that we're going to start looking at the we're going to segment it, this, the reading, the source. So we're going to put it into chunks. We're going to summarize that section. We're going to teach vocabulary and context. And one thing that Stephanie asked me to put on this one slide was to talk about chunking math problems. The same thing that we do with the reading, we need to do with our math problems. This whole idea, because when we chunk it, we're actually narrowing down those skills that the students have to have within math. So I'm just going to go straight to my chunk. Okay, so I've got a reading from readworks.org, which is accessible to all of us. And again, if you need to, paraphrase the, parts of that or whatever it may be, you have the ability to do that within a couple of tools. But we're talking about who's Columbus, because that's our supporting question that day. This is a 4th grade lesson, by the way. So this is one of the sections. So initially, what I want to do is I'm going to pre-teach, and we're talking about tier 2 and tier 3 words. Tier 2 words everywhere. Okay, that means the domains share those. And then, of course, tier 3 is going to be domain specific. So in this case, for me, domain specific is in green and yellow is the tier 2. So belief and world would definitely be words that you would hear sometimes in science. You would hear it, in reading something, in reading and all of that, but and definitely you would hear it in social studies. So I'm going to have those words in yellow, but these words, and I'm going to teach those before we go into the reading. Large body of land, it's going to be a continent. Asia is going to be one of those continents. Down here is the word continent. We're going to take the opportunity to define those. And of course, North and South America. I'm going to teach all of these using a map at the front of the room. I'm going to have that map projected onto my whiteboard. I'm going to mark all over it, whatever I need to do. I'm going to have this reading beside of it. Okay. Or I'm going to put it all in a slide together so that when I project it, I can mark all over this thing and really make those bigger connections. So that's going to be step 1. Step 2, we're going to go into a first read, just reading for the gist of it. Because this is a model of close reading that I use sometimes, especially with my K-5 students. So we're going to read this section for the gist to really understand what happened. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to read that out loud. I don't want my students, I'm not going to do popcorn with that. I'm not going to do anything. I am going to read it. That's going to be an accommodation that I'm going to make, again, for according with UDL. I'm going to read it for every student so they can hear that, so we don't miss anything. Then with my next read, as I said, the second read, I'm going to have those students in small working groups. Okay. This may also be an opportunity that you guys are doing within your co-teaching. But again, someone in that group is going to read that, or I may read it to the whole class again, let them go in, that person's going to read it. And on this side of the text, and this is how I use it with teachers in social studies, on this side of the text, because at the bottom here, you see that we have a very specific using evidence expectation. This is part of our assessment. Students are assessed on their ability to use information according to the disciplinary literacy practices of social studies. So I have to make sure that I'm hitting that home every day or numerous times, a week, every day. So on this side of the text, the students are going to summarize, and the students in their groups, it can be in pairs or their trios, whatever it may be, they're going to paraphrase. They're going to summarize that paragraph so they can really determine. And I'm going to go around and visit all those groups, and I'm going to check in on their summaries on each side. And then over here, I'm going to have a question, that's either, right there on that, in that margin, the handout that they have, or I'm going to project that for each paragraph. But this side of the text is going to isolate the evidence I need them to pull out. There's going to be a question that I'm going to target there for them to use evidence, because that's an incredibly, so sometimes within our sources, and this is something else. So this is the thing I mentioned at the beginning, that sometimes we can use an app or whatever it may be to organize that information. So we're going to be looking at, so sorry about that. I'm going to take that one out for you guys before I put it into the thing. So now I'm going to look at a curative application, as I saw it phrased in an article. And this is called Wakelet. Some of you guys will absolutely love this. Okay. And with the small crowd we've got, hopefully you're out there going to love it. All right. So what I'm going to do with this one is, Wakelet is really good. And it's free, by the way. It's completely free. But there's a really cool feature within Wakelet, and you're going to see why I use it or want to use it. So it's going to create equal access, again, especially in the one-to-one classroom. And every student uses the assistive technology. So therefore, especially within UDL, there's no distinction. Everybody uses it. So again, and you guys know there are the students who are not necessarily who are not within special education, but who could benefit significantly, greatly by the accommodations and modifications that we give, our students, our special populations, but all of them can benefit. There is absolutely nothing wrong. We should do that for all of them. So I'm going to show you Wakelet really quickly, especially as we're coming to the end here. So I've got this QR code, but don't worry about that. At this time, can you all see let me know, can you see my Wakelet? Somebody give me a thumbs up, holler, do something.
Yes, I can see it.
Awesome sauce. All right. If you can't see it, please let Doug know pretty quickly. All right. So this is a Wakelet. And again, like I said, it's free. You can make it all decorative. This was one of the pictures they actually had in their library. So I used it because it was Columbus, but notice it's the Italian or Spanish spelling or pronunciation in this case. So now for all of my students, I'm going to simple, but I use this to demonstrate for teachers, for you all. So I wanted you to kind of see how I could apply this. You can see the social studies standards that I'm using within this. But here's what I did. I took the primary and secondary sources that I needed to use with the students, and I put them in here. And you guys will see that they're chunked automatically. I'm using the excerpts, but again, every student is using the excerpt, not just the students. Because if you guys will go into, for instance, this is a fourth grade activity that I would use or that I would do. And fourth grade, again, we're talking passages about this big, especially when you guys go in and you look at the fifth grade practice test. So we have this, we have a map, and I've told it, and again, this is going to be something that we're going to interact with a couple of days. I'm going to go in, we've got a map here that we're going to interact with. And then here's another primary. Now this one's a little bit big for the primary source. I would cut this one down. And then we have another map. But again, some of these I'm going to use as zooming. In other words, this is going to be bringing together materials that I'm going to use over a couple of days. And I'm going to monitor those. And of course, if you're, working within, if you're working with a resource teacher who comes in, we're going to talk about, a co-teaching model that's going to work best with this. But this is what I wanted to show you guys. This is why I like it. So you can even identify those ones that the kids are going to read. So I'm going to click on this one, the first one here. This is an excerpt from a letter from Christopher Columbus in March 1493. So this is roughly about 6 months after he discovers the New World. So let me show you, it has this thing called immersive reader. Now you guys, this is a big old folder. With a fourth grade class, I would probably cut this down. I would cut two or three of these things off, or I would have it chunked for each day, like 2 sources this day. The next day, we're going to use the map, whatever it may be. I'm going to build it. But here, I just wanted to put everything in there to let you guys know how big it can be and how small it can be. But let me go to immersive reader. So you guys can see here at the bottom. Okay, we're coming up to close. I won't even play it. But you push this, and it's kind of a robot-y voice. Okay, I'm going to hit it just out of curiosity. Let me know, Doug, if you can't hear it.
I promise to our most invincible sovereigns that if they give me some assistance, I will acquire for them as much gold as they need.
Thinking of a strategy that we've talked about in this section, chunking, Rewordify, ChatGPT, and Wakelet, talking about any of those, what is a strategy or strategies that you're thinking that you might try?
I think the Wakelet strategy is very interesting.
And that's what somebody said, or what you said, Doug.
That's what I said. I
And we've
think
got a couple in the chat.
visual strategies and ChatGPT.
Awesome. So now let's talk about lesson planning. We've got about 3 minutes left here because I'm going to leave a couple of minutes at the end for any kind of questions and things like that. So how do I plan a lesson? Well, another resource that you guys are going to have, and I think you guys have kind of seen, this is why I've stopped with everyone and said, is there a strategy? Is there a tool? And you guys, what I've done today is just it's not even the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. The possibilities are endless. You have 3 sources in your folder. You have the full text of UDL, and I believe that came from Casting Incorporated as well, that goes much more in depth into each principle and going deeper into that one graphic I showed you at the beginning. And then this of course, here are key questions to ask. So think about how learners will engage in the lesson. For me, does the lesson provide options that will help all learners regulate their own learning? Like I love the example that Stephanie gives. In math, if they're doing addition and subtraction, students are going to look up and say, I like to use the bead, or I like to use the number line. Whatever they use, when you teach those strategies to all students, they choose the one that's going to help them think best. that's going to help them engage in and regulate their learning. Which one of these strategies is going to sustain effort and motivation? For me, in social studies, that's why I love visuals. That's why when you guys saw on the Wakelet, you saw the map, but then I had, two primary sources that went with it. Because for me, and especially that visual, you noticed it was, pretty colorful, and it had pictures. It didn't just have the list of all the things that we got from the Columbian Exchange. It also had pictures of those coming across. So my students are going to be able to access the information from the place that they can. Then we have, of course, engage and interest all learners. And again, for me, I think sometimes, having, not too many bells and whistles, but those bells and whistles that can appeal across, the board, that's going to help all my students come into it. Think about how information is presented to learners. Notice how this goes along with the 3 principles. And then you have those questions under each one that are going to help you direct it, be directed in that learning or designing that learning. And think about how learners are expected to act strategically. For me, it's all about that disciplinary literacy, as my students source. And again, so many of those things, when I teach it, what we do with it is verbally initially. And then, we're going to get into the verbal / writing it and all of that. We're going to, build from that. But I'm always going to have students talk through things before we ever go deeper into that. And then you have those questions that will guide you through all of that. We've got roughly less than 2 minutes. So going to this last slide here. So the thing I want you guys to think about, I want to talk about it for 20 seconds here. So just shoot it in the chat or open up your mic. So how can UDL help your students access the standards and curriculum through modifications and accommodations in terms of UDL? And, and how can UDL help your students represent their learning? So if you're thinking, and that's the part that we didn't get to go into the most. I did have that mentioned briefly on that one slide. And again, that is, gargantuan. Thinking about, the speak to text, there's all kinds of things that you guys use, all sorts of assistive technology that you guys use that you could teach me on. I'm just really into UDL. This is where I come in at it from, but I know that you guys can teach me. So I'm going to shut up because we have about 45 seconds. So when you guys look at these 2 questions, so just what are some of the things that you're thinking about? Students representing their learning in UDL or accessing standards and curriculum within the UDL? What is something that you've learned today that you just kind of want to mention maybe in the chat or open up the mic?
Kim, this is Dion. Just one thing I wanted to say was thinking about how students have access to the general curriculum in ways, for example, the visuals that you shared would allow students to be able to join in those conversations. And so their reading level would not be a particular barrier, or, you could use the Lexile levels, but just access to being able to engage in conversations and discussions with their same age peers around that same content for that appropriate for that grade level.
Agreed. That's why I use visuals. That's how I learned. And it looks like we have one in the chat too there, Doug. What do you think?
I didn't realize Chat GPT could be used as a resource for modification.
Cool. Absolutely. But
And
again,
one thing,
be careful with it. Go ahead, Dion. You talk about that.
that's what I was just going to say. When we think about that, when we modify, we would only modify standards for students that were on alternate assessment. We're not modifying the standards, but we might use that a way to have kids have access. So just a different way to, make sure we think about it that way in terms of how we accommodate and modify. So we're just a conversation about that, and that might be something we need to follow up on too, because I think time's up. But just knowing that, the different accommodations and modifications, and then when it's appropriate to modify standard.
And I do think that's a big need. Today, I just wanted to kind of show it how I had used it with one, but again, I used it with, all the way, and it didn't modify the content, because I'm not going to do that, but I needed to bring that down a little bit so everybody could read it conceptually, but still had the vocabulary.
Right. So we didn't modify the standard. We modified the accessibility to that by lowering that Lexile level, making that that on a grade level that students could have access to, and could have independent access to that too. So
absolutely.
That gets a little confusing sometimes, but I think that's a great way to think about that is, there are so many ways that we can use those
Yeah.
resources to support our students to get access.
I hope you were able to engage in some learning, and I hope others that watch this later are able to do some thinking and learning into this. And I'm grateful to Dion and the crew here at KVEC for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Kim, for your presentation, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Have a great evening and be safe.